Good afternoon. Today I'm going to give a presentation on liberation theology. And today we will cover just three basic elements: the various liberation theologies, the comparison of J. Yoder's and Dr. King's liberation theology, and I'll conclude with my personal approach to liberation theology. In the course, we've looked at several liberation theologies, and Dr. Gettings' theology of Christianity, Education, and Liberation, based on his book, The Master Say, The Bible Say, is a very interesting theology. Dr. Gettings, in his book, thoughtfully examines and analyzes slavery in the antebellum South and how the Bible was used by slave owners as a means of education to impress upon the minds of the slaves that their servitude was not only mandated but also justified by the Bible, and which the slave's submission to was also a prerequisite for their entry into heaven. Conversely, Dr. Gettings ameliorates the slave's innate quest for freedom by their use of the Bible as justification against slavery, in which they perceived from their understanding of the Bible was their God-given inheritance to be free people and not slaves. Dr. Gettings also postulates a Christian liberation theology that presupposes Christ's announcement in Luke chapter 4, verse 18 through 19, the year of the Lord's favor, was a statement against the institution of slavery, as well as a statement for a perpetual jubilee, in which Dr. Gettings asserts that men would not have to wait for the 50th year of Jubilee for Jubilee to demonstrate God's favor. God's favor would never leave. And Dr. Gettings says it so well. This was Jesus' message, a message of liberation. The next liberation theology that we witnessed in the course was John Sobrano's Christological Theology of Liberation, based on his book, Jesus the Liberator. Sobrano applies his brand of liberation theology to his Christology as framed in the context of the oppressed people in the time of his writing in Latin America, particularly El Salvador. In his book, Sobrano provides two reasons for the development of his Christology for liberation. He says one reason is contextual, having to do with the relevance of Christology to the present situation. The other, more specific, having to do with permanent character. Its permanent character, that is, the historical character of Jesus. The purpose of his book is, as he states, is to put forth the truth of Christ from the standpoint of liberation. Sobrano bases his liberation Christology on what he calls methodological, historical readings of Christ, who is Jesus of Nazareth. Basically, he has a theology to the poor. That's what he believed mostly about Jesus. Well, with Dr. Gettings' thought and John Sobrano's thought in mind, let's look at John Loder's and Dr. King's theology of liberation. Let's compare those two. Let's look at Yoder first. Yoder framed his liberation theology around injustice, speaking, witness, speaking, which is the witness, power of the state, speakers, the church, and change. Yoder was an Anabaptist. He was a pacifist, and thanks large in part to the writing of Reinhold Niebuhr, there was a sense that this pacifist engagement with the state and engagement was somewhat contradictory. Some thought it was an oxymoron. But actually, Yoder thought that this was what we should do, that we have an obligation as Christians to engage the state, even though he felt he was a pacifist, and his Mennonite upbringing also were pacifists. Let's look at a few of his points. He speaks about injustice and justice as an eschatological vision of the kingdom. In this, he's speaking of that Jesus is Lord. He's Lord over the world, and that began at his first advent and will culminate in his second advent. And until that time, that the church has a responsibility to witness to the world, and that the church should not believe that we're going to conform a fallen generation into become a kingdom people. But yet the church had a responsibility even until the time of consummation to speak to the world. And to speak to the world how? This is a few points that he gives about speaking to the world, being a witness to the kingdom. A witness to the kingdom is the church's own experience, and this witness should remain clear. The church should understand its mission and its purpose as a witness of Christ in the earth. The witness to the state must be representative of the church's clear conviction. Okay, there are things that the church must stand up for, things that the church must speak to because they believe those things to be right. The witness of the church must be consistent with their own behavior. In other words, the church must demonstrate through their own actions and behavior what they're holding accountable the state or the world to. And the church should speak only when she has something to say. In other words, we should engage ourselves when there definitely is a need to be engaged. Not only that, Yoder identifies the identity and the power of the state. He argues that the state, though it has power, it is yet sanctioned for God's purpose. Yoder argues that the church does not exist for the state, but rather the state exists for the church to make it possible for God's work to be carried out on the earth through the peoplehood of the church, and that the essential task of God is carried on by the church with the help of the state. And then he speaks that the church is a political power. The church does have a political witness of itself. The Christian community, like any other community, is held together by a commitment to important values. This is a political reality. That is, the church has the character of polis, the Greek words which we get the adjective political, namely a structured social body. There are not two compartments of the world, the church and the world. There's one Lord that's over the church and the world. And so the people of God are called today they're called ultimately to be a witness to this world and to set forth those things that God desires. And this leads us to our next point about change and the ideal society, or narrow correctiveness. Now, many believe that it's the church's job to ready society for the coming of the Lord. Right? Yoder is not necessarily of this thought. He believes that the church has a more corrective voice, and that since the world is unregenerated, it's not realistic to expect the world to transform into this ideal society. We're not called to make an ideal society. That will come at the return of Christ. But the church is called, as Yoder says, to make narrow corrections, to speak to the church about things that need to be corrected, to be critical, and to demand that those things that are not correct about the state be corrected. And even when the state does correct those things, the church must continue to speak in a corrective sense so that society can fulfill its God-given task. Well, in summary, Yoder said the advocacy to the state requires the church to live faithfully, to engage in an ongoing social critique, and to speak out of a lived experience. Well, we've heard a little bit about Dr. Garth, about Sobrinos, and Yoder's thoughts on liberation. Let's look at Dr. King's liberation theology. And I conclude that his liberation theology was based primarily